well, thanks for having me at OpenUK. I'm a sociologist, so I'm also very interested in cross-disciplinary working, and that does put one out of one's comfort zone, and here I am. But it's all good, because it's been brilliant so far, and I hope that I've seen lots of talks that I've really engaged with. I hope that I can do the same in kind of translating. So I'm going to talk about some research that I did a couple of years ago, but because of academic timeframes, we're just getting to the analysis. And it's on open source labour, which is what we're calling it, and it's about how people contribute to projects. And that title, which you can't see because it's not up yet, Hats, Things and Sidelines, is about the language that the participants that we spoke to use when they're talking about their working lives and about how they manage and juggle forms of work, paid and unpaid work. So, okay, I'm just going to crack on. Next slide. So this is, the context to this is that I'm a sociologist of work and organisations, and so the thing that I've been looking at for 20 years is actually unpaid work. And that started looking at volunteering, and then I got into internships, and then I started looking at creative labour in the creative industries, where they call it free labour. And eventually, of course, I ended up at open source labour and the kind of unpaid, paid notion of what happens when people contribute. Now, I get that it's more complicated than that it's just unpaid, and actually the next project we're doing is a bit about how organisations start to intervene in that process. But for the moment, I'm reporting on this study. The aims, it was funded by the Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton, so it's kind of pump prime money. It's very small. It was very sort of piloty and exploratory, and the aim was to just look at how open source, how workers doing open source manage that process. Oh. I'll keep going. How people do open source, how they juggle it, and how they manage the careers and also just their working lives. And I'm coming at this from a sociology perspective, so I'm actually interested in all the different forms of work that people engage in and how that gets managed. Now, there are two reasons why this is important and why it's good to come and talk to you guys, and also it's good for me to talk at sociology conferences. For here, those questions that I'm asking about how people do open source work are all about how sustainable it is. And I know these debates are going on in computer science. I've read the literature, but we're coming at it with a different hat on. And then the second reason that this is interesting for me as a sociologist of work is because we're looking at different ways of working. We're looking at the future of work. We're looking at how work practices change and develop. And whilst you might not have an awareness of what it looks like in other kind of fields, actually there's a lot of innovation in the way in which all of this work happens. So let's look at what that innovation is and think about how that can inform how we understand working lives more broadly. Okay, so minus my slides, but with my notes. I might have to put my glasses on, which means I can see my notes, but I can't see any of you. So, this is going to be tricky without the slide, but never mind, we'll give it a go. So, one of the things that came out of the data, and well, actually, let me just go back, because whilst it's not, you can't see it, so I'm going to need to tell you about what we did, the methodology. We interviewed online 20 open source developers, or people involved in open source communities. We sampled them, we got hold of them via GitHub, so the main kind of criteria for their participation was just that they had contributed in the past year. So we just sort of said, are they contributing? And we didn't put any restrictions around what kind of contribution, are they contributing? But the other thing that we were looking to do was diversity, and we wanted to not just be talking to the kind of usual suspects, but to bring in the outliers, the smaller groups. We wanted a diverse sample, so we used top 10 lists, and we used kind of ways to try and reach these groups. And actually, the sample that we achieved in the end, in our 20, we had 7 women developers, and we had 7 participants who were from the Global South. So we had some diversity in there. All of them were contributing in some form, all of them doing paid and unpaid work. And it was trying to understand this paid and unpaid and what they were doing and how they were doing it that we are still trying to grapple with at the moment. So that's the sample. Now, what we're starting to find is there were 2 key groups in that sample. There were the ones that we called the professional freelancers, and there were the employed developers or employed people. Now, the professional freelancers were all earning enough that they could survive on freelance consultancy work. So their main source of income was freelancing work, and they were doing some fairly high-end bespoke software development, web development in a consultancy, usually through platforms. And for this group, and the title of this talk, which you can't see but is quite useful, is Sidelines, Hats and Things. And this group were very much about things. And when I say things, this was the words that they used to describe the fact that their working lives were constructed by a series of activities. Some of them were paid, some of them were unpaid. And so for them, they created their own personal ecosystem with the freelance work, which was incredibly lucrative, and they all talked about, I've done lots of research on freelancers outside of software development, and they all talk about the rate per hour, and that's how you understand exactly where you sit in the hierarchy of freelance work. And these people that we talked to here were all at the top end of the rate per hour, and so they used their freelance work to subsidize a whole set of other activities. And these were the things. One of them talked about thing 1, thing 2, and thing 3. They all had a range of things, and these included large contributions to open source communities, lots of open source activity, but also other stuff, organizing conferences, all the stuff that Sam just very clearly listed on her slides in a couple of sessions ago. So that was one group. The second group was the employees. The employees had a different language, but interestingly useful to see the same kind of creation of an ecosystem. So the employees were all in almost full-time paid work, usually for a global corporation, at least in the group that we interviewed. And they didn't talk about things, they talked about sidelines. So for this group, their working life was about trying to manage a paid job, but also to do their open source work, and that was their sideline. And they also, like the freelancers, they also had multiple other things going on, but they tended to be much more minimal. And in fact, of course, as you will all know, most of this group were doing the sidelines in the evenings and at weekends. And where it got interesting was where they were trying to use more flexible forms of work offered by employers to facilitate that. So you had people on 10% who used a 10% day, or you had people who were kind of trying to scale down to 4 days a week, and all sorts of ways of trying to manage their sideline alongside their paid work. Okay, so those were 2 key groupings that we were looking at, and how they articulate. Oh, I've missed the third kind of aspect of that, which is hats. Now, the hats narrative is slightly different again, because people with different hats were actually people in more senior roles, and those senior roles spanned community and corporate usually, and so the hats were about the responsibilities that they had in these 2 locations. 1 minute. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip the next slide. I know. I'm sorry. It just ran out of time. So I've got what was on the next slide, which I was going to show you, is 2 case studies. And the 2 case studies are where we get to the key, the important bit, because actually that's where we start to look at the differences and to understand really some of the sociology of this, which is around in institutional structures, labour market structures, and inequalities. So the two case studies, which I'm not going to show you but are useful, are Nikhil, who was essentially working for a global corporate. He had come from Sri Lanka, so he'd spent his whole trainee life working in open source, in an open source community. He'd worked in open source companies, but eventually, because that wasn't earning enough and because there was a very difficult political situation in Sri Lanka, he moved his family to Scandinavia, where he was no longer doing open source, or at least only in a very minor way, and he was less and less able to do the sidelines. So his narrative was all about how he was now basically failing at open source, and he felt really guilty about that we were even interviewing him, because he felt like he wasn't delivering anymore. And that was about him trying to juggle kids, difficult political situation, and whilst he was being paid lots in Scandinavia, it's very high cost of living, so he was managing all of this and not able really to make many contributions in the way that he had been. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Greg, digital nomad, living actually in the global south, earning a huge amount of money doing consultancy and only paying $500 a month in rent. So he was able to work half the year unpaid, doing his contributions, hanging out, being creative, having a lovely life. The other half of the year doing his consultancy work, but always mixed up over the week and the month. So that both of these had narratives about how you manage work on a daily basis, how you negotiate it with your family and households, and how it's all about the resources that's available. This is the sociology bit. The economics of this are crucial, that ultimately you can't do unpaid work for open source if you are not supported in some way by resources somewhere. And so what we're trying to do here is look at that resourcing of work and how it's interconnected, so that anyone doing unpaid work and who is in a family is part of a family, a household, which is part of that support network. Anyway, moving on, because I've only got -1 minute, my concluding thoughts, and I'm making some huge jumps, but firstly, the importance of understanding how people do unpaid work, not just talking to people about why they do it, but how are they doing it? What are the mechanisms that enable certain forms of work to happen, and what are the interdependencies between different forms of work that enable that to happen or not? And that relates to gender, and it relates to ethnicity, and it relates to ability, and it relates to age. It relates to where you are in your career. So there's some really important questions that we need to understand. If we're going to look at the sustainability of open source, we have to understand the how. How is it actually possible? And then the second thing is that if we're looking at the future of work and we're looking at how people work, then actually there's a huge amount of innovation in this industry. There is innovation in terms of the kind of flexibility that is offered. Some of the support, it's not always there, not all commercial organisations support, but some support other forms of working going on in relation to their own. Well, they allow their employees to do other stuff, sometimes. What's the last one? Yes, if the state is going to get involved in new forms of work, then we have questions about whether a minimum income or these other models could be a way in which we can facilitate the sidelines and the things and the hats, and in a sense mainstream that, because it does not happen in other industries. So how can we look at mechanisms that will enable that to happen, and of course sustain open source in the process? Okay, so I think I'll stop there.